Hello, everybody. Andy Jacob here with the .com Magazine Entrepreneur Spotlight Series. Settle back, everybody. I have a great show today. You know, when we talk about everything that's going on in the world, something that's so important, of course, is human development. I mean, of course, human development really shapes the way in which people work. It shapes everything about them. It shapes, of course, their life's work. It changes the way in which people look at the world at large. And we've spoken to so many high-profile CEOs and founders. We wanted to bring a real leader in this field on the show. So we've been able to book on the show today just a terrific leader. I mean, her name is Janet M. Harvey. She, of course, is the CEO of inviteCHANGE. You may have heard of Janet. I mean, she's a best-selling author. I mean, she's won so many awards. She's worked and coached with leaders everywhere from Fortune 500 companies across 6 continents for more than 25 years to startup entrepreneurs as well, and everybody in between. But she's a real leader in human development, and what she's doing at inviteCHANGE and her team is really remarkable. So we're very excited and honored to have Janet on the show today. Janet, welcome to the .com Magazine Entrepreneur Spotlight Series.
Well, thank you, Andy. It's a pleasure to be with you.
It's great to have you. I mean, I love the background. I love that painting and everything. I mean, it looks so beautiful. And it's sort of part of the vibe that you have this great outlook. You have this great sort of bright look at life and the way in which people need to proceed in their life. But before we get started, Janet, let's pull the lens back to 30,000 feet as we always do. Tell us about inviteCHANGE, and then we're going to get into it.
I remember the day that I decided to call the company that. I had just sold a company called Clarity International and finished about a year sabbatical and really thinking about what's the piece that's missing in the world. And I've always had comfort with change. And I realize that's not true for many people. They have a love-hate relationship with it or simply a hate relationship with it. And the truth is, it's happening all the time. So what I know is that if we support each other to examine what is it that we want, what do we aspire to, how do we anticipate what's next in our life, use our imagination, that's the recipe for learning to invite the change we want. And often what gets in the way is all of our sense of preferences and assumptions, maybe even biases that we don't even know are operating and getting in the way of what we really want. So if we can break through some of that, and this is really what generative work is all about, whether that's in a learning environment or in a coaching environment, one-on-one or one-to-many, doesn't matter. All of this is an opportunity for people to hit the pause button and say, what do I want and what must I invite in the way I'm showing up in order to get it?
Yeah, it's awesome. Of course, you and your team, you work with so many great companies. When a company reaches out to you the first time, Janet, and they say, hey, we've heard about the great work you're doing at the company, we want to get involved. What does that first conversation sound like? How do you figure out how you're going to get them, to create this, coach-centered workplace that you become known for, and how you end up working with them?
Right. Notice in your language, Andy, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here. How do I get them? I think this is one of the key paradigm shifts. That first conversation is a little bit like what we're doing. It's an interview where the questions we're asking help that leader say out loud and hear themselves say out loud, what's actually happening in my organization? Not something that's a story to tell for my benefit, because who cares? They already know that. What's happening that is not quite what they want? And if they could have exactly what they want, how do they envision that future? What would be the consequence in the organization? So now we're going to measurement. How would you recognize that this behavior change produces this kind of performance? And what do they perceive as in the way? Where are the gaps that they already recognize in the capacity of their leaders? As they have that dialogue with us, we're essentially holding up the mirror and saying, okay, so if this is your current scenario and this is where you want to go into the future, what's the consequence to your organization of not going there?
Yeah, I like that. That's a great question, of course, and we're always all about the great questions. So when they reach out and when you have the conversation, are you dealing directly with the CEO, somebody with in the organization first, or a C-level executive? Who are you working with first to sort of start integrating and asking all these great questions that you become known for?
Yeah. It's all over the board. I've had individual executives reach out to me for a coaching relationship and then see that there is something for their team, and then see, oh my gosh, my colleagues ought to be doing this. And it comes more organically that way. Sometimes it's a CPO or CHRO that's reached out to say, look, we know we've got a workforce climate issue here, which means our leaders are struggling in some way. How would you approach this? Sometimes it's a CEO. I've had amazing conversations on airplanes that have led to a phone call with the CEO and 2 or 3 of the executive team. So there are a variety of ways in which that happens. And the key is that, somebody's ears perk up when they realize they don't have to continue to suffer in the way that they're seeing the organization proceed. And that first choice opens the conversation that then creates courage to invite change.
Yeah, I love that. Are you seeing something universally in the companies you're dealing with or working with that they need to fix, or like you say, invite change to? Is there something that all companies sort of start thinking about and need to be aware of based on these questions that you ask?
So this is kind of a big idea that I'm going to say here, but I think that almost everything in business is a tension between some opposites. And I'm not really speaking about polarities as much as whatever we put in opposition to each other. And I'm going to say a big one here, which is performance, productivity, efficiency, effectiveness. And on the other side of the scale is relationships. At the end of the day, we compromise the relationships in the name of performance. But we don't realize till it's too late that they're actually dependent on each other. If we're not attending to a person's feeling of well-being, if we're not paying attention to what provides them the space to grow into bigger shoes, necessary, right? That's succession and talent management and talent development. How does the organizational system welcome relationship and development in order to have performance, rather than saying, oh, that's soft skill and discretionary, which is ridiculous. It's the secret sauce, because your people is your only competitive advantage. That's what makes A technology company and B technology company different, is the customer experience caused by the people. So if we're not attending equally to relationships as we are to productivity, that's like trying to cost cut your way to growth. It doesn't work.
Yeah, it's interesting. Now, when you're talking about relationships and performance, the way they're weaved together, are you talking about relationships within the organization, relationships with your clients, or the people that buy your product or service, or both?
All of the above, and the one you left out, which is the relationship with yourself. So, the funny thing about working with executive leaders is they've worked very hard to get where they are. They're very smart. They're quick studies. They don't take no for an answer. Their can't isn't in their vocabulary. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a very soft self inside that wonders some days, is somebody going to figure out that maybe I don't know what I'm doing? Can I say I don't know? Is it all right to be in uncertainty? And for many, that's a real struggle. It's like, I don't want them to see me sweat. And yet, here's the irony. Unless people can see that you say, I don't know, that you're uncertain, that there is something that's uncomfortable and disturbing to you, there's no permission in the organization for that. And that results in low psychological safety, meaning that there's freedom to say whatever you want to say without a fear of consequence. So leaders who can have a relationship with themselves that realizes uncertainty is not my identity. It's in relationship to a certain thing, a situation, a relationship, a circumstance. It's not all of who I am. All of who I am is whole, resourceful, capable, and creative. So when we can remember that, then uncertainty becomes the avenue to see what's next. Creativity gets stimulated, wonder gets stimulated. These are the things that are restoring a natural flow in the organization, where holding it back, not having a relationship with self other than one's persona, actually creates stagnation.
Wow, it's so interesting you mentioned that because I just watched an interview with Elon Musk, and during the interview, there were a number of questions that he didn't know the answer to. And I found myself becoming attracted even more to what he was saying. I found myself attracted even to more of his mission and made me feel a lot better about what he was doing because he could admit that he didn't know. Is that what we're saying?
That's exactly what I'm talking about. It lets our humanity be present rather than something that's a made up identity that's somebody else's expectations, which I'm always going to be chasing because I'm never going to catch up with them because I've already done it. So why bother, right? Be connected to something interior that, is your unique gift to bring. And remember that none of us do anything alone. We always do things together. Collaboration requires that we're able to say, there's space here for you because I don't know and you do. So how do we put our forces together? And that's the relationship with self that can have the self-esteem to recognize that that's actually quite healthy to not know. It's the only way to a growth mindset, right? Which is, of course, all the rage these days. And rightfully so, right? Being able to help people recognize if you can't be a learner with the pace of change that happens through technology today, in fact, you will always feel left behind and less than. It's not necessary.
Yeah, it's so great. And you mentioned growth mindset for the younger entrepreneurs watching the show. Let's sort of encapsulate what that is a little bit from your perspective. I know you just wrote the award-winning leadership and coaching book called inviteCHANGE, Lessons from 2020. I love it, the year of no return. That's great. How does growth mindset integrate into what people need to start thinking about to become better at what they're doing?
Yeah. So, a really simple, this is Carol Dweck's work out of Stanford University. And a kind of a simple way of boiling it down is that there's a fixed box of knowledge and skills and capability to apply the knowledge and skills. And when you get that formula met, then you're going to be successful. And of course, the problem with that is that the world is dynamic. So you're always, again, be chasing. It's a little bit like a revolving door. Growth mindset, by contrast, says, I accept that the world is always changing, and my job is to pay attention to the signals and to experiment and pay attention to what results, and then be in reflection and pick up the things I might have missed and identify where I have habits and preferences that no longer fit the situation. So ultimately, what we're going for is, can I be spontaneously appropriate to context? Now, I don't do that out of routine and formula, which is our personality. I do that out of my character. How do we develop our character? Through experience and reflection on experience that helps us connect with, oh, I had capability there I didn't even realize I had. That's growth mindset, that I believe I can rise to any occasion if I'm paying attention to what's actually happening rather than running on autopilot.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. That's so beautiful. And for the entrepreneurs watching the show, rewind what Janet just said. That's a real gem. Let's talk about relationships. Here we are, we're on Zoom. You and I are having an interview. There's a lot of companies that are doing virtual work. Everybody's talking, not in person. We're all using technology to talk. Has the dynamic of the relationship building within people's sort of organizations changed because we're all on technology versus seeing each other in flesh and bones?
I appreciate the question very much. And I would say this has been a bit of a moving target over the last 2 years as the world has adapted. And I think what you're really zeroing in on is the notion of presence. How do we recognize when someone is present with us? There are cues that we've learned to pick up on. And it's more than the nonverbals. Of course, leaning in, nodding your head, having eye contact, those are all useful. But those are a little more subtle in the online environment. I know many leaders who cannot see themselves. They cannot see their image when they're on technology. Well, that would be a growth edge. Because if you can see yourself, you stop being self-centered. Right? If you can see yourself on Zoom and not be worried about whether your hair is right or your makeup is right or your clothes are right or your kid interrupts you, you have your humanity back. When you have your humanity, you can be with whoever's in front of you because you're not trying to manage something, right? That energy gets freed up. So there's a self-awareness and an understanding that this environment isn't any different than if you were sitting next to me in the chair.
Wow.
We can have an energetic exchange if I'm willing to show up that way. And if I'm willing to give you the space to show up that way, rather than being judgmental about, I like your sign or I don't like your clothes or, I wish you'd get another pair of glasses. Like, really? Is that what we're talking about? I don't think so. I think we're talking about how to help leaders up level their game. And to me, presence and being authentic in our presence is the first key. An awful lot of organizations trained managers to oversee process. So reports, budgets, project timelines, are things happening on time, performance reviews, sending people to skills training. This environment needs so much more. They need to have room for people to speak about what's been my experience, because I haven't had eyeballs on you in the cubicle down the hallway, right? You haven't dropped into the break room. Instead, we've been out doing our own thing, which means what used to happen casually in the hallway needs to have defined space. We need to make room for, maybe one team meeting a month is just personal check-in. What are you excited about from the last month? What surprised you in your work? Who in the network of project teams that you've been on do you have great gratitude for? Where's a place that you found yourself doing something you didn't think you could do? All of these things are acknowledging that we're going about our lives despite the disruption, and it's working. Paying attention to what's working and giving space to it. So those are a couple of things that come to mind, and it's not going away. I had a PR, pretty well-known PR person say, "What does year of no return mean? I don't understand that." Which I found very interesting, because the reason I used that subtitle was to say, everything I grew up with in my 40 years in the workplace doesn't exist anymore. Whether it's technology did it, or the pandemic forced us to use technology differently, or from an environmental perspective, getting on airplanes anymore kind of conflicts with my value system, or we have 5 generations in the workplace now. Like, do I need to keep going on? There's so much that we're never going to go back to, because these combined cascade of crises and disruptions are having us rethink what's important, what matters, how do I choose on that? And that's what the Great Resignation is all about. Like, I've had some time to think about, what do I really want? And going forward is going to look very, very different.
Wow. And that goes right together with what you mentioned about the growth mindset, and this whole idea that you have with regard to presence really resonates for me. And it's very important to be present and have presence, of course, when you're dealing with people. Let's talk about corporate culture. I mean, I look at you as sort of an expert in corporate culture, one of the leaders in America in that regard. How important is the corporate culture? Is it still as important as it once was, or even more important than what it's ever been?
I want to make a little bit of a distinction between culture and climate. And the reason is that culture is essential, no question about it. However, in its nature, it's more like a brand. It isn't something you make happen. You can't go do a culture project. It doesn't work like that. Culture is how we come to recognize the way things get done around here. That's kind of a simple shorthand for it. And so it emerges out of the way work gets done. We say, oh, that quality of expertise, that organization has scary smart people, and expertise is what they're about. When people come in and do culture consulting, they have you look at colors and cars and animals and all kinds of ways to identify the way one experiences the culture. So if you want to change it, you have to change the experience inside. And that takes time to override our preferences, because I came to work for an organization because of its culture. How did I know what that was? Values, principles, mission, vision. interviews. I got a sense of who the people were. I looked at their background and history, and I said, oh, this is the company I want to keep. And then the organization decides it wants to change its culture. And I'm like, whoa, wait a second. Now I have a conflict, right? And so you see attrition when you do culture change projects. It doesn't mean not do them, but do them with your eyes wide open because the disruption is meaningful. Climate, by contrast, is something we can influence within 60 to 90 days. It's leader driven. Gallup data would tell you the most important relationship is the one you have with your direct boss. And you either stay or leave because of it. So that leader influences that team. All leaders influence all teams. Then that becomes amplified. And when we say there's a toxic culture, we should really say there's a toxic climate. Something has happened in the behavior of that leader that is having a ripple effect where people are feeling an absence of psychological safety, some form of emotional or economic insecurity, if not actually inertia, and they're making things crazy because they're out looking for a job and not doing their work. All of that can be tied back to the leader. What's the leader paying attention to? And of course, here's the downside. Lots of times an executive will say to me, I have this one person on my team who's been awesome for the 7 years they've been here, and then the last 6 months has been terrible. Can you coach them? What would I be coaching them on? Do you want them to be productive again? Are you invested in them being a viable person in your organization? Well, I don't know. Well, not if they're still doing what they're doing now. And I said, so what happened in the system 6 months ago? Dead silence. It's always dead silence. And they're like, well, what do you mean? So did you change this person's scope of responsibility? Did the organization get out of a line of business that this person was being groomed for as a promotion? You know, did you decide to favor somebody else on the team? Think long and hard here. What happened that this person was no longer feeling like they fit in the organization? Self-determination theory, Ryan and DC. So we want to be seen as competent. We want the autonomy to exercise our competence. And then those two need to be met in order to feel like we belong. So if we've upset the apple cart here somewhere, that person's going to act out because they need something that organization isn't meeting anymore. It doesn't make them a bad person or a misfit. It means the system needs to pay attention, right?
Yeah.
That's climate work. And that's easy to address through coaching.
I love it. I mean, the difference between corporate culture versus climate work, I mean, it just resonates for me and it's so powerful. And I know it's going to resonate for everyone watching the show. Janet, I know you only cut out a certain amount of time, but I've got to get into giving back to the entrepreneurial community. So let's do it. You know, we have some younger entrepreneurs watching the show. Maybe they're having a tough time. Maybe they're hitting a roadblock. Maybe they hit a wall they can't get through. Sometimes they freeze in the frame. They don't know what to do. For the younger entrepreneurs watching the show, maybe you could share some insight, you know, maybe some growth mindset or something that you can offer to them to help them get through these tough times as they're going through their entrepreneurial journey.
Yeah. So I have two things, and they're a little bit of corollary. So the first one is 4 A words. And many of us have felt stifled in our imagination. So this is a place to reconnect with our imagination. The first A is anticipate. Where have we stopped anticipating what's coming next? Stopped listening, stopped paying attention, stopped being curious, stopped reading, stopped listening to Andy's podcast, right? And started to think, I wonder if that might. This is seeing around the corner before you get to the corner. Whatever business you're in, that's important that you're anticipating because it gets your juices going. The next is aspiration. So as you're sitting around the corner, what do you want your motive power to be as you get around that corner? Aspire to something bigger than what you're doing right now. Then adapt. What's in my way? In the way that I'm working, what's keeping me from choosing? Think about all the restaurants that went to takeout, that went to curbside pickup, that went to delivery services and aren't going back because they're doubling their business. Adapting. And then ultimately align your team. And if you're feeling like you have to solve it all yourself, check yourself at the door. You have people on your team that will be so appreciative that you've given them the opportunity to bounce ideas off of and participate with you. Anticipate, aspire, adapt, and align. Now, here's where you can get stuck in the mud. Where have you got a habit that's outlived its usefulness? Where do you have a preference that's keeping you trapped in an identity that isn't going to serve? Where do you have assumptions you have not checked out? And where do you have a bias that simply no longer fits with who you want to be in the world as a leader? What do you want to stand for? Doing a bit of inventory, asking those questions, what habit, what preference, what assumption, what bias, it's got me stuck where I am because it doesn't fit me anymore, will help you exercise your imagination on the 4A's.
Wow, that's so powerful. I love that so much. I mean, again, I have to say it rewinds, of course, what Janet just said. You know, I see it all the time. The great entrepreneurs, they're anticipating, they're aspiring all the time. And of course, they're adapting as they go. And then they're trying to get their team aligned with the vision. And then the thing that you mentioned, which is really powerful, is, of course, sometimes they don't really think about their bad habits or their bad assumptions or their biases or their preferences. And that's equally as important to the first 4A's. So, wow, what a great show this has been. I want to thank you so much for coming on the .com Magazine Entrepreneur Spotlight Series. This has been awesome. And again, thank you so much for cutting some time out today.
You bet. Thank you, Andy. Appreciate your work.